Hi, everybody. Welcome to a brand new program here on the Captain Lou Sports Network on YouTube and 12 Ounce Sports. We're calling it the Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History. How the show is going to work is each month we're going to pick a year to chronologically look back at some of the championship teams in sports history. And we thought for the month of May 2024, we would start out with a year near and dear to our heart here, that being 1984. It's been 40 years since the Detroit Tigers won a World Series championship. So we thought we would take a look back at that. So each week in every month, we're going to take a look at one of the championship teams. Again, we're just going to pick at random the years that we choose. So in June, who knows what year we're going to take a look back on. But for the month of May, we thought we would look at 1984. And again, this program here this afternoon, or tonight rather, depending on whenever you're watching it throughout the world, we're going to take a look back at the Detroit Tigers, and we have a special guest looking back at it with us, Fred Heumann, sports anchor at Channel 10 in Lansing, Michigan, WILX, and a longtime sports personality in the Detroit, Lansing, and Flint, Michigan area. He was kind of front and center for that run back in 1984, so we had a chance to chat with him, and we're going to give you that episode here shortly. So, again, a brand new show here on 12 Ounce Sports and the Captain Lou Sports Network on YouTube. That, of course, being the Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History. We hope you like it. It's going to be fun. It's going to be informative. It's going to be a look back at history, as we say, as some of the great teams and the great runs of some of the championship teams. It's not going to be just the four major sports. We're going to throw in some college teams that were dynasties. Who knows? Maybe a look back at a Masters run. Throughout the years in sports history, we're going to go back probably from the 70s up to the present. But we're going to pick a year at random. We're going to even get you involved too. We're going to run polls each month to find out which year you would like us to take a look back on in sports history. So kind of the gist of what we're doing here. It's Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History. And today with Season 1, Episode 1, the premiere episode, we're going to start out with the year 1984, as I mentioned, and we're going to take a look back at the championship run of the Detroit Tigers in 1984 with their last World Series championship. And when we come back after this break, Fred Heumann from Channel 10 in Lansing, right there, he was front and center for all of it. He'll take a look at it with us, and we'll get some cool stories from that run in 84. Don't go anywhere. You're watching the Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History.
Do you need tickets? We have you covered. We have soccer from anywhere in the world. Any venue from any sports. That means we have college and professional football. We have baseball at every level. We have every Power 5 matchup. Remember, costumes and paints are optional. You want to see Broadway? We have them too. We have every concert from every artist. We have you covered at tickets.12ouncesports.com. Tickets for less.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back again to Captain Lou's History's Championship Years in Sports History. And here in the month of May, we're going to highlight 1984. And of course, here locally in the state of Michigan, we had a magical run with the Detroit Tigers getting to the World Series and making that run to the championship. And we thought it would be fun to bring in someone that is very familiar with that run of the Detroit Tigers back in 1984. On Channel 10 right now is sports anchor Fred Heumann. Fred, thanks for taking time out to be with us. How are you?
Captain Lou, I'm fine. My pleasure. How you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. Anytime I get to talk baseball, and of course that run to 1984 to the World Series, I was a sophomore at Central Michigan, and so we were front and center watching that with bated breath that whole year, and it was quite a run for the Tigers.
Yeah, it was. At the time, I was actually working in Lansing when the season started, and then during that 35-5 run at some time, I got a job at WJRT TV in Flint, and I worked Flint that summer during the Magic season. And on the side, I had a freelance gig. I was hired in 1979 to run the Tiger Stadium scoreboard. I don't mean the balls and strikes. I did all the messages that came on the big board. I was the main control operator. So I did the game in progress board and all the messages that came up, like, when Trammell hit a home run, I'd put up there, wham, bam, thank you, Tram, stuff like that. So I controlled all those, and I didn't work every game, but I worked a lot of games that summer, so saw a lot of games and covered the World Series a little bit for my station in Flint, and then eventually got to Detroit, and I got to know all those guys a lot better. But it was a fun summer and a great memory.
Boy, Fred, before that season, as well as I do, it was a lean time for the Tigers. My first memory of the Tigers was playing hooky in '72, watching the American League Championship Series with Laren LeGros getting the bat thrown at him by Bert Campaneris. And then we suffered through some lean years with Ralph Houck, and then we got Sparky, and we got the strike shortened season in '81, and it looked okay, but boy, oh boy, we made it. Detroit, they were close a couple of years, but, obviously, they made the big trade with getting Willie Hernandez and Dave Bergman, giving up Walkenfuss, who was one of my favorite players. But, Fred, do you think going into that '84 season, first of all, was there a lot of pressure starting to mount on Sparky Anderson to really get something going for the Tigers?
Well, he had a 5-year plan, and that was year 5 because he was hired in '79.
Yeah.
He weeded out a lot of bad apples, Captain Lou. I mean, he spent the first couple of years getting rid of the bad people. I mean, Sparky felt that not only did you have to be a good player to play for him and the Tigers, you had to be a good person too. So he weeded out the bad apples and got rid of some, fairly popular players in the community and on that team, and brought in his own style of player. And it took some time. You mentioned the half playoff run they had in '81 in the strike season.
Yeah.
They had some moments in '82 where they were really good. And then in '83, it came together and they had a really good year in '83. I don't remember their record, but they kind of hung around all year. They had a good team, and that was kind of the precursor to 1984, which, built up. And then, as you mentioned, that big trade with the Phillies kind of made them a different team.
Yeah.
I was a good friend of Dave Bergman's. God rest his soul. We lost Dave several years ago. And Dave was always a little sensitive to the fact that we all in the media called it the Willie Hernandez trade. And Sparky, Dave was proud of saying, I was part of that too, and he was a key member of that team. And Sparky and any of his teammates will tell you the same thing. He gave Detroit great defense at first base, and of course had some big hits. We'll remember the 14-pitch at bat when he ended up with a home run, and I mean he was a key part of that team too. But there's no question that Hernandez was the key because he ended up winning the Cy Young and the MVP, and he was unhittable for most of the summer. And it was obviously a brilliant trade at the time.
Fred, and the big acquisition too, getting Darrell Evans. And I remember reading Sparky's book, the Bless You Boys book, what a difference he made in the clubhouse. And then right away, Fred, the first game, he gets a home run up in Minnesota to get the ball rolling for the Tigers.
Yeah, he had a lot of big hits too, and you're right. He was a big part of the fiber of that team. He was a veteran, and he was a guy looked up to by the other people, and he had a calming influence in the clubhouse, and he was just a real professional and a real team guy, and everyone kind of migrated to him, and he took on a leadership role, and he enjoyed it, and he fell in love with Detroit, as most players do when they come there to play, really in all sports. We're seeing it with the Lions now. We've seen it with the Red Wings for years. I mean, athletes who don't know much about it come to Detroit and they see what happens in that community. And we certainly saw it last week with the NFL draft. They see how the crowd and the fans embrace them and make them one of their. There's no secret that a lot of guys that played in Detroit, this is Tigers, Red Wings, Lions, whatever, even Pistons, they've stayed in the community, and now in their 50s and 60s, they're still living there, because Detroit has become a home to them. They have other business opportunities springing off from their careers that allow them to do other business deals, and players really end up liking to play in Detroit, but you got to try it first. And Darrell is one of those guys. I don't know. I didn't know him then, but I don't know what his reaction was to going to Detroit, but obviously he was a free agent and he signed there.
Yeah.
But I do know, in knowing him over the years, that he fell in love with Detroit and has very, very fond memories of that season and his whole tenure as a Detroit Tiger.
You know, Fred, you talked about the tenacity of that team, and you had some Bulldogs, obviously, with Jack Morris and Dan Petrie, Dave Rozema, just to name a few. Jack got that no-hitter in the fourth game. That was Easter weekend, if I'm not mistaken, because I remember being home watching it on TV up in the Upper Peninsula, and what a way to set the tone. And Jack was just one of those reliable pitchers throughout the decade of the 80s for the Tigers.
Yeah, it was a Saturday afternoon in
Yep.
Chicago against the White Sox. It was on national TV. I was watching too. and it kind of set the tone for the Tigers then. They were off to that great start. And he threw that no-hitter, and it got a lot of national attention. And the Tigers, of course, started like gangbusters out of the gate. And that kind of was a catalyst for certainly the early part of the year. And you're right, Bulldog is the proper name for Morris. I mean, he was just one of those guys. He was kind of a tough guy to be a teammate of, but he was one of those guys that you'd rather he play on your team than on the opponent because he'd beat you every time. He was that much of a competitor. He was a warrior. He was a snarly guy, snarly even with his teammates and with the fans and certainly with the media. I've had conversations over the years with Jack, and he's admitted how he regrets how he behaved as a player. But much like his teammate Kirk Gibson, that was the way they were. That was whether you admire it or not, and it wasn't always very admirable, but it was part of who they were. It's part of what gave them that edge. It's part of what gave them that competitive fire. And years later, they probably both regret being that way sometimes. But at the time, it worked magic for the Tigers, and both those guys were similar personalities, but true warriors. Both Morris and Gibson were just unbelievable warriors, and the Tigers rolled their coattails. There's no question about it.
You know, I had a chance a couple of years ago to talk to Fred Lynn. I know he didn't play on that team, Fred, but he said when he got to Detroit, he said the first thing he said is, I can see why they won in '84, how talented they were, but he said he played on teams earlier, obviously, with California and Boston, but he never played on a team as workmanlike and as focused as all of those players were, from Trammell to Gibson to Parrish to Morris. And that, to me, is an ultimate compliment, too, to Sparky Anderson.
Yeah, well, that is a high compliment, and Sparky would have it no other way. As I said earlier, it was the type of people he had and the type of professionalism that he believed in terms of how you carry yourselves on the field, how you act in public, how you dress, how you treat people with respect. I mean, Sparky he demanded that. I mean, there was an incident, I don't remember who it was, but there was a young man with he was physically and mentally challenged. I don't remember if he had cerebral palsy or what it was. And a couple of the players, Gibson was probably one of them, were laughing at this kid. And Sparky hauled him in the office and he read them the riot act. He said, "Don't you ever disrespect those people. You owe them an apology." That all came from Sparky. And Sparky and Gibby will tell you now, they had some near fist fights in the office. I mean, they had some arguments. They went nose to nose, but Gibson wrote a book about Sparky and how his leadership and how he mentored him, shaped him as a ball player and a young man. I mean, he has high reverence. You get Trammell or Gibson to talk anytime, any of those guys, you bring up Sparky and they just rave about him. I mean, you know, the guys that didn't like him played elsewhere. But those people that went through that '84 season and through those years in Detroit, they absolutely adored Sparky and worshiped the ground he walked on.
You know, I think the closest manager I can see right now, Fred, in modern day baseball is Bruce Bochy. And just personality wise, if nothing else. And I know he's a little more old school, which is what I'd like to see anyway.
Right.
Yeah,
they're similar. Yeah, they're kind of similar in that regard. But those old school guys are my favorite, really. There's not enough old school managers in the game anymore, if you ask me.
Oh, I'm right there with you. We're joined here on the show tonight, very gracious with his time, Fred Heumann, Channel 10 sports anchor, longtime sports personality here in the Lansing and Detroit and Flint area, talking about the year 1984 and the Detroit Tigers' run to the World Series championship. Fred, you talked earlier about Willie Hernandez and the run he had with the AL MVP and the Cy Young, but the crazy number 2, and we all can remember, is senior smoke, Aurelio Lopez, 10-1 as a reliever, and 2.9 earned run average, something like that. To have a 1-2 punch like that out of the bullpen was absolutely amazing. And it wasn't just that year. Aurelio Lopez had a great career in Detroit.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that because we're kind of used to that now. There's a lot of teams that have 7th inning and 8th inning and 9th inning guys, but it wasn't designed that way back in the 1980s. But Aurelio Lopez was kind of the 8th inning guy, and then Willie Hernandez, later Guillermo Hernandez, was the 9th inning guy. So they had that 1-2 punch before it was fashionable. And Aurelio probably would have been a closer on most of the other teams, and certainly would have been the closer with the Tigers had they not traded for Hernandez. And there was no shame in that. But as a 1-2 punch, yeah, they were tough as nails. And you forget about Aurelio, Senior Smoke, God rest his soul, but he was very much a key part of that bullpen as well.
You mentioned it. They started out 35-5, and I think Dan Petrie and Jack Morris both had double-digit wins by June 15th. How difficult was it, do you think, to keep that run going? I know it. Obviously 30 games over 500 in the first 40. They ended up winning the division by 15 games, I think, over Toronto. But at times it had been difficult to keep that run going. I know they had a few 3 or 4 game losing streaks.
Yeah, not many. That 35-5 start though did cause all the success. There's no question about it. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of pressure starting that way. The players will tell you about it now. I remember a story, Sparky, when they were out in California once. He's probably written this or told it to other people, but they were out in California once, and I don't remember where it was, but they were in some restaurant or store, and some guy came up and recognized Sparky Anderson. Now, this is the time when the Tigers, in the middle of July and August, were a daily story nationally. Yeah. They made national news with the way they were running away with it, and with that 35-5 start, and some guy came up and recognized Sparky Anderson. Sparky, you were my hero. You managed the Cincinnati Reds. I was a big Reds fan, and you had all those world championships, and you're such an ambassador for the game, and it's such a pleasure to meet you. And Sparky said, well, nice meeting you. And the guy looked at him and said, by the way, Sparky, what are you doing now? and Sparky has written that, and he used it to his players that don't ever forget who you are. Because here they were in the middle of this magical season, and this guy remembered him from the Cincinnati Reds and didn't even know he was managing the Tigers. And Sparky always told that story fondly because it gave him real perspective on don't get too high on your horse or who you are. But yeah, they were a big story wherever they went because they made national news of that big start and all the personalities they had. Yeah. Jack Morris was a personality. Kirk Gibson was a personality. Lance Parrish was a personality. Darrell Evans was a personality. Chet Lemon was a personality. They had all these guys, and they were good with the media, and they made a lot of national headlines, and they were just a fun team to watch. And for the little bit that I did cover them, a fun team to cover.
And I had the opportunity and the pleasure a couple of years ago as well, Fred, to talk to Rupert Jones when his book came out. And it, I know he only lasted 1 year, and I think he really harbored some ill will going into 85. But, boy, he brought, again, one of the role players, Rusty Kuntz, another one, Johnny Grubb. With
Johnny
some
Grubb,
big
Johnny
hits.
Grubb, yeah.
You talk about personalities. I think Rupert had 12 home runs. Grubb with some clutch home runs. Barbaro Garbe as a rookie. Yeah. Wow, just some fun names to look back and think about.
Yeah, and for as much as we talk about the competitiveness of Jack Morris and the clutch pitching of Dan Petrie and the and the will to win that Kirk Gibson offered, and the steadiness of Trammell and Whitaker. Those role players you talk about are every bit a part of what makes a champion. And that happens most years in baseball. Yeah, the stars stir the drink. There's no question about it. But those role players you mentioned, Jones and Grubb and those guys that produce big moments. Those guys were a big part of this too, and the players who played with them never forgot that. I mean, those guys that are very much a part of that team. Doug Bear was kind of a journeyman pitcher at the time, but he had a lot of spot starts, and he was good in the bullpen, and he was a key part of that team too. That really was a 25-man roster, and they all contributed one way or the other.
We talked about the start, and we talked about the season they had. Fred, it boggles my mind that they're only one of 5 teams that have led from wire to wire throughout the whole season. And I think the last time it happened was with the Reds, I think 1990. That tells me how big of an accomplishment that really was.
Yeah, it is. And the other thing, and I've had Alan Trammell, he comes on my radio show once in a while, and a few years ago, it just didn't dawn on me how long it's been since the Tigers have won it all. I think at the time we talked, it was 35 years. Here it is, 40 years.
Isn't that something?
That tells you how hard it is to do. I mean, who would have thought when we celebrated that 1984 championship that here, 40 years later, they still have not won another one? I mean, that's a long drought, and that, to illustrate your point, that tells you how hard it is to do. That's why there aren't a lot of repeat champions. That's why a lot of teams don't stay on top. And that team that kind of stayed together had another run in 87, but couldn't get over the top, and that was the closest they've been. They, of course, made the World Series in 06 and again in 2012, and came close in 2013. But all those near misses, none of them added up to a championship. And here it is. We're in 2024, and 1984 was the last World Championship. A little hard to believe, isn't it?
Boy, it's incredible. You think of the teams they had, 15, 20, or 10, or from 2006 to 15, and couldn't quite get over the hump. And you're absolutely right. It makes you, you just try to appreciate it when you've got it. And,
right.
You talk about Johnny Grubb. When we get to the championship series, I can remember like it was yesterday, Fred, when he hit that double off of Quisenberry, who in the 11th inning in game 2. And you think that you talk about a guy who was unhittable for so many years, Dan Quisenberry, and Grubb got that double. And it was that was magic right there. You knew that you really, if you didn't already know it, you knew you had something special there.
Yeah. And that's what I'm talking about. Those role players who have so many big hits. You mentioned Barbero Garbe. I mean, those guys all had some kind of contribution to that team, and every victory counted, of course. He ended up running away with it, but all those role players and all those guys that had those big moments are something that their teammates have never forgotten, believe me.
And then, of course, they won that last game, or game 3. Charlie Leibrandt pitched a perfect game, or not a perfect game, a complete game against Detroit. They still lose 1-0. And, and you looked at the other series, Fred, and I know, I shouldn't speak for you, but I know I was one that was kind of hoping they would play the Cubs. And, when I saw Rick Sutcliffe hit that home run in game 1 against the Padres, I thought there was no way the Padres were going to win that series. And, the Cubs with the GOAT, or whatever you want to call it, the bad luck at the time, they blew that 2-0 lead. And who would have thought they would end up playing the Padres in the World Series?
Yeah, that was. There's no question. Most people wanted a Tigers-Cubs World Series. It would have been a rematch of 1945 or 1935 and 1945.
Yep.
And I think that a lot of people in the two towns and their personalities are so similar, and they're both, Midwestern blue-collar towns, and that would have been a perfect matchup. It just didn't happen.
Yeah.
And so because it was the Padres, it became a little anticlimactic until the Tigers came back and won that game 5 in dramatic fashion. I think by that weekend, everyone had, because it was a Saturday, Sunday when they beat the Padres to wrap it up. And I think by that time, people, at least Tiger fans, had long gotten over that it wasn't the Cubs. They were just happy to win it, because at the time, let's see, 1984, they had not won one since 1968.
Yeah.
And to illustrate my point earlier, I remember that time, that seemed like a long time. 68 to 84 was 16 years. And here we are after 1984. We're 40 years and still waiting, just to illustrate that point, because 68 and 84 seemed like a long time. And that was only 16 years.
And, we talked about it at the top, with the Tigers, the lean years of the 70s growing up. I would just dream about what it would be like to have the Tigers be good. They went through that 109 loss season, and you saw the Yankees and the Orioles and the Red Sox, and thinking there they are way up there and we're down here. So yeah, I'm glad they obviously were able to take advantage of it. But here, when they went into the World Series, Fred, the big controversy maybe at the time was when they put Marty Castillo in at third base, so instead of Howard Johnson, caused a little bit of a stir. But as it turned out, Sparky pushed the right button.
Yeah, as it turned out, Castillo had a good series.
He sure did.
He had a good defensive series and got a couple of big hits. And I don't think Hojo ever really got out of it. And eventually he was traded for Walt Terrell.
Yeah.
But I think Hojo was one of those guys. Not that he's a bad guy. I think Hojo is revered by his teammates, but I don't think he was Sparky's type of player. And they made that move, and it's not quite like Mickey Stanley moving to shortstop in 1968.
No.
But you're right. That was kind of a gutsy move, and it turned out well for the Tigers, as everything they touched that year did. I mean, everything seemed to click for them.
Were you worried after they lost game 2?
Not really, because I thought they were by far the better team,
Yeah.
although the better team doesn't always win in sports. But no, I didn't figure they'd sweep San Diego. If they'd have lost those home games, then it gets a little troublesome. But losing game 2, I didn't think was that big a deal because they won games 3, 4, and 5 and wrapped it all up. But it was a magical summer and a great series. Great for the Tiger fans because they won it. Probably wasn't so great in the memory of San Diego fans, but it was a fun time, and it's hard to believe. You and I are sitting here talking about these little moments that happened 40 years ago, like they happened last week. But that's what happens when you win a championship. Those moments are kind of embedded in your mind forever when you win a championship.
Fred, I've listened to you talk about baseball for a lot of years here locally in Lansing. Tell me the first Tiger game you ever went to as a kid.
Boy, I don't know if I've ever been asked that, and I can't remember that. All I know is that my dad took me to a lot of them. So it had to be, I was born in 57, it had to be in the early 60s.
Okay.
The longest ago I remember is 1965. I remember watching the World Series that year, the Dodgers and the Twins, but I can't remember any specific Tiger game necessarily until 1967. I was there in 1967, the last day of the season.
Ooh.
When the Tigers had a doubleheader with the California Angels, and there was a 4-team race for the pennant, and the Tigers split their doubleheader, and Dick McAuliffe hit into a double play to end their dream and end the season, and the Red Sox won that year at the Impossible Dream.
Yeah.
I was in the stadium that day, but by then I was 10 years old. I had certainly gone to a lot of Tiger games before that, but certainly that 1967 last day of the season is one that's fresh in my mind, sat right behind the screen. And the only foul ball I ever caught, I don't remember what year it was off the screen. I had my glove, and it was hit off the screen, a foul ball by Al Kaline.
Oh, wow.
And I, many years later, had him sign it. I still have that ball. It's the only foul ball I ever got, and I caught it off the screen there when I stuck my glove off. But I don't remember what year that was. But, yeah, my dad took me to a ton of games. In fact, in 1968, he took me to 47 games.
Wow.
And Denny McClain, who pitched on that team, I joke with him now that I went to more games that year than he did, and he pitched for the team.
That's awesome. My first game was County Stadium, 1974. Woody Fryman had a no-hitter going into the 8th inning against the Brewers, and Aurelio Rodriguez hit a 2-run homer, and they won 2-0. And I was hooked before that, but boy, if I wasn't hooked, I was hooked then, man. It just, there's nothing better than going to the ballpark for an evening game. I don't care what anybody says.
Yeah, I'm a baseball guy, so you're preaching to the choir. I tell people, they say, "What's your favorite sport?" I said, "Baseball." They say, "What's your second favorite?" I said, "Baseball." You want to try for a third because that's baseball too. So I tell my wife, sometimes she accuses me of loving baseball more than her, and I said, "Yeah, but honey, I love you way more than soccer and badminton."
I know the rule here is my wife said she's not going to start paying attention to baseball till June 1st because I've got her watching a lot of hockey, but baseball is always going to be near and dear to my heart. What was your favorite World Series that you can remember, Fred?
You mean not necessarily involving the Tigers?
Right. Yeah. Anything, it could be the Tigers or any of them.
I was in college in 1975 when the Red Sox played the Reds, and that Carlton Fisk home run off the foul pole, very, very memorable. Not to mention there was a pitcher for the Red Sox back in the time. In fact, he pitched in that World Series, who was my substitute teacher in high school. His name was Jim Burton.
Okay.
And he pitched in that World Series, if you remember that name, a left-hander, tall, lanky left-hander. So I knew Jim Burton. So 75 is certainly a big memory for me. Of course, the Tiger World Series 68 was what had to be number one, because as much as you're talking about 1984, 1968 was my team. That's the team I grew up with. That's the team I watched all those guys grow up and become major leaguers, and to win it all in 1968 was just an incredible memory for me. And 84 was big too, but I wasn't a kid anymore. I was a grown kid, and I was in the business. And, as I said, I worked the scoreboard. It was just different. It was exciting. But I would say 68 and 75 stand out. I don't think I've ever been asked that, but if you ask me, my two top World Series are 68 for the Tigers and 75 with the Red Sox and the Reds.
Well, Fred, this has been an absolute treat talking baseball with you in 1984, helping us usher in our brand new podcast, the championship years in sports history, starting out with 1984. Couldn't think of a better year to start with here locally. And again, thank you for your time, and keep up the great work at Channel 10. And I listen to you every so often when I can on my day job when you sub for Tim Stout on the radio show. So again, keep up the great work, and thanks for taking time out tonight.
Well, thanks for having me. My pleasure. Good luck with your podcast, Captain. No, I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. All right. There we go. Fred Heumann from Channel 10 WILX in Lansing, stopping by to talk about that great run for the Detroit Tigers in 1984. 35-5 start all the way to the World Series championship. Of course, that iconic Game 5 home run in the 8th inning by Kirk Gibson off of Goose Gossage, the Hall of Famer, bullpen ace who for a lot of years was with the New York Yankees. And what a great time it was. And we couldn't think of a better way to start our new podcast, our new program here on the Captain Lou Sports Network and on 12 Ounce Sports, Captain Lou's championship years in sports history. So again, what we're going to do is each week of a month, each month we're going to pick a year that we are going to look back on with championship teams, try to get personalities that covered the teams, try to get some ex-players from those teams, and just kind of look back at those great runs that those teams had. So we started out here with the month of May, Episode 1, Season 1, 1984. And again, the Detroit Tigers with that 35-5 start to that year onto a convincing World Series championship win over the Padres. And many thanks to Fred Heumann, currently of Channel 10 in Lansing. He was right there front and center with the Detroit Tigers in their run in 84. So we hope you enjoyed the program. Join us again next time. We will again focus on another championship team. Next program will be the Edmonton Oilers and their 1983-84 run to the Stanley Cup Championship. So again, thanks for joining us here on our premier program, Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History. We'll be back next time with another edition with a look at the Edmonton Oilers. All right, Captain Lou saying keep your heads up, keep your sticks down, keep your feet moving, and as always, keep your minds open. Thanks for joining us on the Championship Years in Sports History right here on 12 Ounce Sports and the Captain Lou Sports Network. So long.